Welcome back, Wayfinders. Today is a fun day. We get to sit back and talk through a podcast-like interview with myself, Travis, and my wife, Tila. I will introduce myself first. You've seen me on the channel a few times. I'm a survival instructor. I've been teaching wilderness survival for 15 years. I'm also a first responder and aspiring EMT. We'll see how this summer works out for me as far as certifications go. And I've been working search and rescue on a work and volunteer basis for years. Tila, why don't you tell them a little bit about yourself?
I grew up with conventional agriculture. My grandfather owned a dairy. My parents owned a horse farm. I branched out into gardening and permaculture, eventually also learning blacksmithing. So that's my skill sets.
Together, we've been focusing a lot on the homesteading and survival approach for the last few years, and we're aspiring to set up a homestead 5 years from now. In 2026, we're going to be moving to Michigan and starting a homestead full-time. So we're using the next few years to gather experience and knowledge and hopefully build a community of individuals who want to ask questions and learn from us as we learn from them. So today we're going to start off with some real basics, and we're going to start with the basic needs. What do we need in order to survive? And how do we define what survival actually is? We've broken this down into 6 different questions that will let us know our left and rights when we're talking about these terms: survival, homesteading, wants, needs, and Maslow's. So the only way to get started with this is to explain what we're talking about. If you're not familiar with Maslow's hierarchy of needs, it starts off at the bottom with the very basics that you need to survive. So Tila, what is one thing that we need in order to not die?
Well, the pretty obvious one is air. We need air to survive.
All right, I'm going to categorize that as a form of sustenance. And I know that's not typically how it's talked about, but we literally take in air and expel air in the form of CO2 and oxygen, not respectively in that order. And we're consuming it and it is sustaining us. So absolutely, we have air as a form of sustenance. Give me another one.
We have shelter, clothing.
Shelter, clothing, fire, anything that protects you from the elements, we're going to roll that into maintaining body temperature. And for those in colder regions, realize that maintaining body temperature sometimes means keeping yourself cool. And for those in warmer regions, realize that sometimes maintaining body temperature is keeping yourself warm. So as long as we're near 98.6 or more recently adjusted to 97.8, then we're good to go. All right, so we have air and we have our temperature. What else can kill us?
Our health.
Health, anything that cuts us and makes us bleed and makes us lose that precious lifeblood is a bad thing and can result in our death, absolutely. So health commonly is seen as protection from wildlife or from exposure at the environment, or any medical conditions a person could have. But I like to think of health as both physical and psychological. Both are critical in order to continue surviving. The only 2 that we haven't hit here are food and water, which again would be in sustenance. So if we look at it from a broad spectrum, the only 3 things we really need in order to not die on a minute-by-minute basis is sustenance in the form of food, water, and air, a consistent body temperature, and no physical or psychological health issues that are large enough to compromise our survival. Fairly basic. And I can guarantee you, every one of you readers, not in this case, every one of you listeners out there have had enough of this in order to not die because you're listening to this. So this is stuff you should be doing on a daily basis as you breathe and listen and eat and drink and take care of yourselves and shelter from the rain and get in from the cold. You're naturally doing all these things. And that is the bottom tier of Maslow's hierarchy of needs, the physiological needs. If we move up from there, we find our safety needs. So T, what would be some safety needs that we require in order to protect ourselves?
Well, we require the ability to protect ourselves from wildlife or other humans or...
Okay, absolutely. Wildlife, and I sometimes include humans as a form of wildlife, even if we are far more dangerous given the amount of tools and intelligence that we have. This doesn't necessarily mean firearms or weapons. It could also mean isolation or creating a barrier between yourself and the threat. And a barrier is anything that creates time between you and that individual or you and that creature. A wall, a river, a mountain, terrain features. All those things lead into making yourself safer. Moving up Maslow's hierarchy, we have love and belonging right in the middle. I'll just list these ones off. Friendship, intimacy, family, sense of connection. On a day-to-day basis, these aren't things that are going to kill you. If you lose a friend or you don't have family and you're not connected, yes, it can become depressing. It can be something that impacts your psychological health. And in the immediate sense, it won't kill you. But in the long term, having a lack of these things can have consequences of a life and death nature. Moving up to esteem, respect, self-esteem, status, recognition, strength, freedom. This is building ourselves up to self-actualization, which is the tip of the hierarchy. And that's the desire to be the most one can be, or paraphrased these days as living your best life. However, if you hear someone saying it's living your best life, I guarantee you they probably have a live, love, laugh poster on their wall back home. So that's Maslow's in a nutshell. And to be clear, it's not a nutshell, it's a hierarchy. It looks more like a pyramid. You should be familiar with some of this if you've taken any entry-level college courses. They harp on it hardcore. We're not here to teach Maslow's. We're here to draw the line between our needs and our wants. And we're going to do that by defining short and long-term survival. So let's get right into it, Tila. Question 1. What do people mean when they say survival or survival skills or survival training? Take your best swing.
Well, I think when most people say survival, they mean the very basics of survival, staying alive, say, in the woods. I think that's generally what people think of when they say it.
I would agree. If you ask somebody how they're going to survive in an apocalypse situation or an emergency, they immediately jump to food, water, personal protection in a form of equipment, clothing, and health, medical kits, that kind of thing. They jump into like that stereotypical survival mode where things are going to impact their immediate self and compromise their ability to live. However, as we've talked about in the hierarchy, if you have the bare basics met and you start moving up Maslow's and you don't fulfill things like community or friendship or security, and you don't start working towards some of those longer term survival goals, they can start negatively impacting your survival as well. So we need to draw a line between short-term versus long-term, because short-term is going to be the skills that you need to get really good at in order to stay alive, and long-term are going to be the skills that you need to think about and start building over time. So question number 2 is, where do you draw the line between short-term and long-term survival using Maslow's?
Well, I think that the general line between short-term and long-term is going to fall between the physiological needs and safety needs are going to be your short-term survival, I think, and everything above that is going to be very necessary for your long-term happiness and survival.
Yeah, in general, I'd agree. There's a few things in safety needs that personally I don't see the immediate value in, like property. Owning property is not a necessity for me to keep living. It does make it easier, as does any kind of resource. How do you feel about resources? Is that a short-term or a long-term need?
I feel like resources really supports your short-term survival. I think it makes it much easier to, say, build a shelter if you have the resources in order to do that, or the resources to continue to eat or drink. I would kind of put the birch bark to build a bucket as a resource.
That's true. It depends on what level of resources you're talking about. I assumed when I see resources, stockpiles and the ability to produce firewood, that kind of thing. So maybe I'm viewing it a little bit differently as well. You'll need some resources, but building up those resources over time will make survival easier as you move on. Now, it's important to note that as we're building our community, as we're building our survival into a lifestyle and having our focuses shift to long-term survival, at any time during any day, you can be knocked down that hierarchy of needs into the physiological or the safety needs. Even if everything is going really well in your life, just tripping and falling in a survival situation and breaking your leg brings you down to the bare level of sustenance and survival and makes you focus on those basic needs before you can start climbing that ladder. You can't live your best life or be the best version of yourself if you're focusing on trying to stay alive. So it's something that we need to continuously climb. Now, question 3 starts to bring in a debate subject that I've seen on survival and wilderness sites, where there tends to be this mentality that the survivalist is a lone wolf, just one man out in the woods with a gun and another gun and 6 knives and a third gun and then bullets for those guns, and that man is a survivalist.
One man against the world.
One man against the world. It seems like survival has turned into an
action movie flick.
Yeah, a fantasy, I would put it. I've been in survival situations, and it's not just a die-hard movie in a forest setting instead of a skyscraper. So question 3 is specifically geared towards breaking that myth that you have to be a crazy woodsman prepper and an introvert who doesn't enjoy people in order to survive. Question 3 is developing and maintaining a community. Is developing and maintaining a community important to long-term survival?
I feel that for long-term survival, building and maintaining a community is one of the most important things that you can do. It's important to be able to survive yourself, but eventually you're going to need to have more community than just you.
Absolutely. So if we take the scenario of the one man against the world in the wilderness with his guns and his knives, and we play that scenario out as if that person is surviving an apocalypse level event, what we see is somebody who's incredibly capable at maintaining their health, maintaining their safety. They probably have food stores and the ability to feed and water themselves, and they're going to be good to go on that short-term survival for a little while. Where do you see this guy running into survival problems?
Well, everyone needs to sleep.
Yeah, exactly. Like, if you wander up on this guy in the woods and he has all these amazing toys and he's zonked out sleeping in his beautiful bedroll next to his wonderful guns, and you pick one up and you shoot him, all skill is for naught. There's an old saying that says, it's actually kind of a funny one. I'm already cracking myself up. It says, all skill is for naught if an angel pees in your touch hole. And that's not what it sounds like. This is where using old flintlock rifles, if you let water come from the sky, rain, and go into the touch hole, which is where the flint would actually ignite the powder, then your round wouldn't go off. So it wouldn't matter how skilled you are as a marksman. If you get water in that touch hole, your equipment fails you, and then you fail yourself, and you're not going to put that round down range. So all skill is for naught if an angel pees in your touch hole. Try not to say that around schools. I don't know if people would understand the context, and you might get yourself in a little bit of trouble. So this individual cannot protect themselves when they're asleep. let's say they barricade themselves in a building and they have a bunker, and now they're able to maintain their safety whether they're sleeping or not, and they're fully prepared for every eventuality, and they're living their happy little life for a couple of weeks this way. Where's the next breakdown in their survival?
The next breakdown in their survival, a group with even bigger guns, more guns.
So you always
You can't barricade yourself forever. Eventually, you need to leave that barricade, and when you do, there's going to be another group.
Absolutely. With this type of survival mentality, you always have to be the biggest fish in the pond if you're not going to have people come after you, especially if you're the type of person who's broadcasting that you have all this preparedness, you have all these guns, you're posting on Facebook and social media saying that you have these stores and you're ready to go, and man, you can't wait for the power to go out, because everyone who knows you is going to know that you're a target for resources. And when people get desperate, they get stupid, and they will come after you no matter how threatening they think you are. So if you're by yourself, people are always going to be a threat to you.
If you're by yourself, you will never be the bigger fish.
Exactly. Numbers matter. There is safety in numbers, absolutely. You also have to realize that someone who's doing this, who is isolating themselves, is unable to climb the rest of Maslow's hierarchy of needs, and they keep themselves in the animalistic survival, short-term survival mode, which eventually has long-term psychological effects. They'll never be able to reach up to having a family or fraternity or individuals around them, which will allow for community building and eventually self-actualization. It is a wonderful short-term plan, but a horrible long-term plan. So I agree with you completely, Tila. If you're going to focus on survival, and you're going to focus on all of survival, short and long term, you need to build that community, which is one of the reasons why we're having this discussion today, to bring more people into our community and start opening up the discussion about real world, long-term survival and homesteading, which are synonymous in a certain mindset. So let's finish up question 3 here. You'll eventually need to sleep. You're less likely to be attacked or raided if you're a part of community. So why do you think you would be less likely to be raided or attacked if you are part of a community?
Well, your community is not going to be attacking you, raiding you, so that closes a lot of that avenue. But in addition to that, it's more intimidating to try to attack a larger group of people than a single solitary individual.
Absolutely. And if we had a neighbor who we're friends with and we're trading with and we're giving them honey and they're giving us maple syrup, and somebody comes down and attacks our neighbor, how's that going to make us feel?
Oh, well, we'll be threatened. We will have to retaliate, or we will be a target.
And we call that retaliation justice. A society seeks justice when somebody is wronged, and that is a threat to those who are willing to do evil and do harm to others. So the interesting thing about justice is that when a society comes together and finds the criminal and holds them accountable, whether they're putting them in jail or prison or fining them or in extreme cases putting them to death, the society is what's getting the justice, not the individual who is wronged. No amount of punishment is going to undo what happened to the individual, but society feels safer for it, and it's more of a deterrent in the long run. So if you have friends and family and neighbors who are all on your side in a post-apocalyptic setting or a survival setting, or even when the lights go out and a snowstorm hits really hard, you've got people you can rely on when you need them. They have someone they can rely on when they need you, and you have a society that protects itself. This is probably the strongest tool you could have in a wilderness or a survival setting of any kind. Because there's one thing I can guarantee you is that you can't be on the top of your game every single day. But if you're in a community, somebody is, and you can take care of the ones who aren't. Anything else on question 3, T?
I think that one thing that you kind of have to think about in the very long term is, if you don't have a community, the human race will not continue. You cannot reproduce like an amoeba.
Right.
We need
Asexually.
community.
Right. Absolutely. So what's the goal of survival, right? Is it a selfish endeavor to not die as an individual? Some would argue yes. Or are you trying to maintain a society and maintain the human race? In which case, you can't do it alone. And I think
Absolutely.
you said it really well. So it's good to be capable for short term, but you need to build that community for long-term survival 100%. And we're going to get into this a little bit later, but that may mean that when you're storing and prepping and building up food and water stores, maybe you store a little bit for your neighbor as well.
Now, one thing that I would like to point out is when we say that this is for a survival situation, we aren't necessarily meaning it's a survival situation like it's an apocalypse. It could simply mean that you are a community living far out from immediate care, where you need to work together with the rest of your isolated community. Maybe you live in Alaska or some such place like that, where you need to rely on your community.
I would add that any community can become isolated. If you look at the folks down in Florida during major hurricanes, when all the gas stations get pulled dry and everybody evacuates, very quickly you have individuals who are isolated in micro communities.
Very true.
You've got Houston when it was flooded, Hurricane Henry, I believe it was. You had entire towns in Texas who were cut off and isolated, even though they were in a major metropolitan area.
Even in our town of Trout Lake, when we had a blizzard and it took out power and it took out trees across the roads, we could not get to the nearest grocery store.
That was only 4 miles away. Mm-hmm. Yeah, we were stuck for several days, 4 miles. And we were a capable crew here with 4x4s and winches and plows and chainsaws.
But
and
the rest of our community weren't necessarily so capable, and there was trouble from it, but it worked out well enough for us and for our community. But it could have been bad.
We're accidentally transitioning directly into question 4, which is a statement that I wrote down ahead of time because I knew which direction we were going to go with this. Is with all this post-apocalyptic talk, I'm beginning to feel like the insane person holding "the end is nigh" sign. So the question is, number 4, are we crazy?
I do not think that we are crazy. I mean, a crazy person might not necessarily know they are.
Right.
But I think that what we do is not out of a sense of craziness.
Well, there's a big difference between prepping / hoarding and preparedness.
I agree.
Right. It's okay to be prepared as long as you're not negatively harming other people by over-preparing or hoarding supplies. One thing I absolutely detest is when people run to the store prior to a storm or a power outage and they buy as much as they can, selfishly trying to stock up and leaving other people with less resources. The panic buying craze.
The panic buying craze, you're right, is extremely selfish, and it is hoarding. If those people had been prepared to begin with, there would have been more available for the people who needed it.
Absolutely. If everybody had a little bit of preparedness and everybody had a little bit of extra supplies, some rice, some beans, some lamp oil, inverter for their car, a few other things we're going to suggest later in question 6 when we talk about materials and things to stockpile, then we wouldn't have to panic buy. As a society, we would be ready. And that's one thing I think we're actually going to see a change in modern day society because of COVID and because of all these catastrophes that have been happening in the last 5 or 6 years, 10 years if you go back, and you start looking at the grand scheme of things. Individuals are starting to prepare. They're starting to stock their pantries. They're starting to build up their gear.
They're starting to listen to FEMA, who even is saying that everyone should have at least, I think it was 3 days worth of food and water and the ability to keep yourself warm.
Right. And it's not like you need to build a bunker in your backyard, although that would be fun.
Maybe amazing, but
maybe we are crazy. But buying $50 extra in groceries every couple of months and throwing them in a pantry, having a full tank of gas and a 5-gallon gas can in your garage ready to go are pennies on the dollar method of preparing. You don't have to go full tilt and buy number 10 cans full of dehydrated Mountain House food. You can prep with local stores and for a very small amount of money each paycheck and build yourselves up so you're not the one panic buying at the store. I know when COVID first kicked off and we were locked down, we were lucky enough that we had everything we needed for that moment, and we were able to just stay home and avoid those crowds who were going in and just stripping stores out of toilet paper and everything else. So that became a very memeable moment, so we're not going to dwell on it too hard. All right, so going forward, having a little bit of extra gasoline, have a little bit extra food. There's a big difference between storing enough food for your family for a month and storing enough food for your family for 5 years. It doesn't make sense to have a ton of extra food. And I just read an article about this where a family was clearing out an old Y2K bunker that was built in their basement, and they were throwing away thousands of pounds of spoiled food.
So never been used, just hoarded in their basement.
Hoarded and expired. Military does a lot of things very similarly, where we build up great big stores and then years later they're found and redistributed or just thrown away. So you see these things happen all over society.
Horrible waste.
So what are some ways that we can avoid wasting our money, resources, and time?
Well, when you're talking about like long-term food storage, what you would do is you would rotate it. The first in would be the first used. You would never use your newest stuff first. Always rotate your food stores out. So you should always be buying things that you will use, just more of it.
Mm-hmm. And one lesson that we learned is with our food stores, we were storing food that we didn't typically use in our day-to-day cooking, like dried beans and raw rice and things like that. So when the time came to use our food stores, we weren't as familiar with how to make them palatable as we would have liked. We had a couple of meals that were pretty much just bean water at the beginning until we learned how to actually cook that food. And that leads us into question number 5, is how do you walk the line between being prepared and being a resource hoarder?
I think part of it is being able to actually use those supplies and use them up and refresh them without wastage. You're not buying so much that you can't use it up, that you waste it and throw it away.
And this is something that we've gotten better at recently as well, where we'll buy food that has a long shelf life, and then we'll consume the exact same food that we bought a few months ago that has that same shelf life where it's coming due. So just like you were saying, Tila, the first food in is the first food out, and having that rotating supply. Because if you're eating from a rotating supply of food rations, then you never will have spoiled rations. When one thing starts to go bad, you eat a little bit more of that until it's gone, and then you replenish it with something that has a longer shelf life. And this solves 2 problems. 1, you're not losing money on expiring resources, and 2, you're getting better at cooking your own prepper food. I hate to call it that. What's a better word for prepper food?
Long-term stores.
You're getting better at eating your long-term stores, so that when the time comes to cook your 80th bean meal in a row, you'll know how to spice it up just right to have a little bit of variety in a diet.
I think in addition to that, by not wasting the food that you're not using because you're using it, you're not wasting it. You aren't taking food that other people need. You aren't taking it from their mouth, basically. You're
letting it rot in your pantry.
Yeah.
Yeah,
You're
because
keeping that food available in the system.
if everybody bought twice as much food as they need and let half of it expire, we would require twice as much food to feed the world.
Exactly.
You've got to be efficient because it's good for you and it's good for the community. And another bit of advice I have on that is if you overbought some kind of long-term storage food, and my mind keeps going back to beans for some reason, I guess.
Beans are long-term storage.
Long-term storage, and man, did we have a bunch of them. Those are something that would be excellent to share with your neighbors and see if you can
send
trade
it to
them.
a food pantry even.
Yeah.
People are always in need somewhere.
Or cook them up and feed them feed a bunch of people at a warming shelter. Growing that community protects you and it protects others. Just last year when we were up in Michigan trying to prepare the homestead, we had a 4-day power outage due to an ice storm. My neighbor, who's a really good friend of the family, I won't use his name here because I don't know how many people are going to listen to these podcasts, and I don't want to start naming certain individuals. So if you know who you are, I'm talking about you. You came over and you helped us. You gave us some maple syrup. You helped us dig some holes in the yard with our orchard that we were putting in. I know that we didn't have power for a couple days, and you gave us a generator to use. And in return, when a tree fell on this individual's power lines and were going to cause a big issue when they turned the power back on, I was able to go over there. I'm a little bit younger, a little bit stronger, and I was able to cut that tree and take care of it so that he didn't have power out for longer than everybody else. So I used a little bit of my excess resources. He used a little bit of his excess resources, and we both had a better stay because of it. While other people were trying to flee the area, we were able to stay because we built up our little micro community of just a few people. So you're always going to have situations where you can help someone else, and you're definitely going to be in situations where you need help from someone else. And we've been harping on that pretty hard. Any other additions to walking that line between being prepared and hoarding resources?
Just that I think that while you share your resources with others, you should also be very careful to keep what you would call operational security and be very careful about maybe not telling people exactly what and where and how much and all the details of what you keep so that you don't make yourself into a target. Even in non-survival situations, people do bad things, and you don't want to be a target for a thief or something like that.
Humility goes a long way here, and I know that when you get a nice shiny new gun or you buy a really cool piece of equipment that will help with your survival, a propane stove or a water filtration system, and you're excited about it, the first thing you want to do is throw it up on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, or in my case, YouTube, and show off your capabilities. But that you are advertising resources for the desperate when the time comes.
And
so
you just need to be prepared for that eventuality. You can share your excitement with others, but you need to be understanding that could lead to a problem down the line and be ready for it.
Yeah, and especially young adult males or young aggressive males, we call them yams. I was one once, so I can say that. These yams can sometimes take your resources and your preparedness as a challenge, and you don't want to be measuring up against individuals who could win and could hurt you or could hurt your family. So be humble, be gracious, and give out what you can and build that community without advertising everything that you own. So I'll keep a couple of secrets up, a couple tricks up my sleeve as well, even though we do a lot of broadcasting on this channel, and I'm definitely being a hypocrite here. But I'm not going to be the person who is making myself a target in these types of situations. So we've backtracked a little bit. Question 4 asked if we're crazy, and I'm starting to feel like we're doing some crazy talk here. So let's make it a little bit more realistic here. Let's take a scenario for question 6. We're going to take a scenario like our 4-day power outage due to the ice storm, or like the first few days of lockdown, or responding to tornadoes in Kentucky, or hurricanes in Florida. Let's take a very realistic and very likely scenario and give a little bit of advice to our listeners so that we can help them out next time one of these comes around. So question 6, and our last one for the day, is what are your top 5 things to keep on hand for emergencies like storm, power outages, and panic buying events?
Well, I think that the big thing that people talk about, but they don't really prepare it enough is going to be water. You're going to need a lot more water per person than you think. And you really need to plan ahead for that. You need to have drinking water. I think it's, what is it, a gallon of drinking water per person?
The minimum, if you're not exerting yourself, is going to be a half gallon of drinking water per person per day.
And if it's going to need to be more if you're eating things like freeze-dried foods that need to be rehydrated.
Right. You have to cook in that water. You have to flush toilets. You have to clean yourselves, maintain hygiene. So a good rule of thumb would be on hand in any household, you should have 5 gallons of drinking water per person and another 5 gallons of non-potable water that you can use for hygiene or flushing toilets and that kind of thing. So a big thing that we used to do here is back in the States, we had, before we moved to Germany, we had a 300-gallon fish tank, and it was a freshwater tank for one big reason, is that if we lost our power, we could take a pitcher of water out of that tank, and even though it's got fish poop and fish guts and fish food in it,
and all sorts of mean, nasty things, you can take a big pitcher of that, dump it in the toilet, and flush the toilet, no matter how bad the plumbing is, no matter how frozen your house gets. Your septic isn't pressurized, and it doesn't require electricity. So if you have a fish tank, you can easily flush your toilets just by borrowing some of that fish water and not tapping into your stores. So that 300-gallon tank really helped us in a lot of situations down in Georgia. Oh, for sure.
All right, so we got flush toilets, baths. You can build water over time. This is something that we're actually falling a little bit behind on. We have a 7-person household, 5 kids and the 2 of us. So we should have 50 to 70 gallons on hand. We should think about that.
You also need to think about if you got pets. You need to plan for their water use as well. Their drinking water or their feeding or whatever they might require on a normal basis. You need to plan for them as well.
Right, and I know I mentioned it already, but you can't ignore that hygiene. Just because you're in a wilderness or a survival or isolated situation doesn't mean you can let yourself get really gross and nasty, because then you're going to start getting skin lesions, you're going to start having health risks, you're going to start having all kinds of issues. It can also negatively impact morale if you start letting yourself getting really gross in these situations.
Is true.
So keep at least 5 gallons of potable and 5 gallons of non-potable per person, and that should get you through a 3 to 4 day stay. Any longer than that, and you're going to need another water source. If only we had like a flowing creek in the backyard.
Oh,
infinite water source.
I guess it's a good thing we do.
I guess we do right now. Not when we get in Michigan, but currently in Germany, we have a little creek in the backyard. So we have infinite non-potable water, and I have purification pumps and techniques.
Oh, that's another thing that you might want to keep around is a method of purifying more water.
All right, so that's number 1 is water on hand and water purification techniques. We could talk about that one all day.
For sure,
but there's your number 1 for your top 5 things to have available for these types of situations. Number 2 is that food that we were talking about earlier, canned and dry foods, and a way to heat them up or to warm them. So what did we do at the lodge in order to help us out with this the last couple of years during the renovations?
Oh, well, for our renovations, we put in a propane system for our stove, so we always have the ability to cook on our stove. We did not have that ability when we lived in Georgia. When the power went out, we had no immediate method of cooking when we first got there. We had to
improvise.
We had to improvise what we were doing there.
We did an entire Christmas dinner in Georgia.
Oh, that was in Arkansas, yeah.
Oh, yeah, in Arkansas. An entire Christmas dinner in a smoker. We were smoking whole pots and pans to boil the water at a high temperature so we could make pasta. The only cooking capability we had in Arkansas during this power outage, this is another one, not the one we were talking about recently, and this was years ago. This is when Liam was a baby. It was 8 years ago, 8.5 years ago. We cooked an entire Christmas dinner. We even baked the bread in that smoker, and that's when we learned a very valuable lesson. So we installed, like you said, a propane range top in our lodge up in Michigan. And when we had a power outage more recently, we were melting snow on that thing. We were cooking bacon and eggs. We had no reduction in cooking capability because we had a propane stove available.
Correct, but because our propane stove is electric start, we did need to make sure that we had a method of starting it at all times, which is just matches.
Yeah.
It's all you need for a propane stove. For other, if you don't have a propane stove, just keep around a jet boil or a...
Well, heck, we used a jet boil to heat a bottle for Liam in that Arkansas snow.
Yeah.
We filled the jet boil with water, got it boiling, and then you dip in the boiling water the whole bottle with the milk in it, and I think we were using formula at the time, to warm up his bottle, because that baby doesn't know that you don't have the ability to warm that up on the stove or microwave, right? That baby needs a warm drink, and you need to have the capability to meet its needs, because they're not children are not as good at being resilient as adults.
For sure.
So if you have a whole bunch of dry food and rice and you lose power, ask yourselves this right now. If you lose power right now, can you even cook the food that you have in your pantry? At one point, we couldn't. We learned that lesson. We're trying to help you learn it now. So 1 is water, 2 is food and the ability to cook that food independent of infrastructure. That'd be the professional way of putting it. 3, lanterns and candles. I know this sounds real like 1940s of me, but lanterns and candles will allow you to ration your battery-operated devices. And you're allowed to keep those battery-operated devices longer and keep them going for a longer period of time. They also, the candles and lanterns also provide a small amount of heat. We heated that living room up with, 3 lanterns and a bunch of little
tea lights.
Lights. And that kept our house warm for a little while in Arkansas. These things are pennies to get those little tea lights, and they really come in handy.
You could get votive candles. You can get those Coleman lanterns anywhere, and lamp oil. You can get it at Walmart. You can get it anywhere.
If you're using those little Coleman lanterns where you can crank up the wick, they make lantern oil for it, but in a pinch you can put citronella in there, you can put kerosene in there, you can even put diesel in there. It's going to stink.
You probably should not do that in the house.
Yeah, it's not a great thing, but in a survival setting, we're going to have to start determining our needs a little bit more specifically. I know we put kerosene in one before because we had to, and it worked for us. I do recommend stocking up on that lamp oil. So having lanterns, headlamps, battery-operated headlamps are great as well.
And make sure you test them periodically to make sure that the batteries are still good. Don't assume that because you put the batteries in there and they were fresh, that they're always going to be usable. The batteries do wear out after a while. We all know that.
And that brings us right into number 4, is some ability to recharge batteries and recharge your phone and your laptops and things like that. And one of the best ways you can do this is just having the ability to charge on 12 volts from your car. Even with full infrastructure collapse, you can go out and start your car if you have fuel, and you can idle it and you can charge your batteries with a cigarette lighter, or if you buy one of the nicer inverters, you can hook it directly to your battery, and you can even run major appliances off a car as a small generator at a very, very little cost for startup. Obviously, having a big generator would be awesome, but not everybody's in that mode.
Additionally, having a big generator can make you a target from the noise. So running a generator as little as possible would be something to think about. So maybe having large batteries to charge with the generator, and then to use to charge your smaller electronics.
An idling car is almost silent these days if you don't have the cars that I own. If you have the newer cars, someone would definitely notice if we were idling the Suburban out in our driveway. It sounds like a generator, just at a low roar. So have the ability to charge those electronics. We at one point had to resort to an inverter off the car battery in order to run the fans that blow air around our wood stove, because our wood stove is wonderful at making heat without electricity. It's not very good at moving that heat around the house. So between the time where we had a power outage and Al lent us a generator, we were briefly running the stove off of an inverter from a car battery. And that allowed us to keep our house warm until Al lent us that generator.
But we're not using names.
Well, no, I use a pseudonym. That's easier and less awkward.
So, work for us to use the fans off of the battery, but make sure you plan ahead for that. Don't leave it to the last minute to figure that out. Always have that ability in place before you need it.
And these are lessons we've learned and adapted from. Like right now, we have a 10,000 watt generator sitting in the garage with the proper electrical hookups. And we could, at a moment's notice, power our entire house off of that generator. But we learned this lesson in the snowstorm while we were cobbling together solutions that we weren't prepared for. So don't take our podcast or our content here on YouTube as we have never made any mistakes. What we're saying is we've made all the mistakes. We've learned all the lessons. We're trying to spread the knowledge and get us all better at this with the least amount of people having to suffer through the challenges that we went through. Now, I'll admit, I love those moments when the power drops and the ice is coming down and you hear a tree creaking nearby. Ooh, that is exciting time for me. I get excited for those. I remember when we were cutting trees off the road and our buddy of ours, another T, came around the bend in his beat-up old car, and he had 3 chainsaws in the back, and they're like, let's make this happen. Everyone else wanted to go get hotels, and we're out there building fires and clearing roads and having a good time doing it. It is excellent to know you have that capability.
The ability to improvise and adapt to your challenges is important.
Absolutely. In fact, that could be an entire another podcast.
Maybe it will be.
Number 5, and the last one for question 6, is lots of extra blankets. Even if you're in a hot environment and you're relying on air conditioners, if you put blankets over your windows after your air conditioner goes off, you can maintain a cooler temperature in your house for a longer period of time. So blankets are comforting, they're warm, you can bundle people up in them, and allows you to weather both hot and cold environments. So keep some of those on hand.
When the power went out in Texas during that unexpected blizzard, the biggest problem people had was their heat. People heat with electricity down there. It's generally too warm for them to want wood heat or gas heat like we do in the north.
Right, they use heat pumps
but
primarily.
They did not have that ability, and a lot of them struggled to stay warm. And one of the things that they suggested was to put up tents in your house to make a smaller, warmer area to warm. But something we all learned as children is that blankets make amazing forts.
It can be a wonderful thing in an emergency to be able to distract your children a little bit. We've been through multiple tornadoes. We've been through freezing ice storms. We have a dozen or more survival stories as a family. And I know for a fact that if you let the stress pass from you and into your children, it's going to make it a lot harder for you to manage them as well as yourself. So distractions with blankets, distractions with toys, all of that goes a long ways.
In Arkansas, one time when Travis was away on business, our oldest son and I were home alone during a major tornado event that knocked all of our power out. And it was a major tornado. It hit south of us, skipped over our house, and then destroyed the town north of us, which we didn't know at the time. But to stay
Valonia.
safe,
Destroyed Valonia.
Absolutely, demolished it. So to stay safe, obviously, we had to. Zachary and I had to stay in a smaller interior room, which he was not used to sleeping in, and he was scared and upset, and he did not like this idea of not sleeping in his bed. So what I did was I took all of our extra blankets and his toddler mattress, and we built a mattress and blanket fort in this interior room. And Zachary was not only entertained, no longer scared of this terrifying storm outside, but we were safe, we were warm. It's I think it's very important to make sure that you have the ability to use those extra blankets.
That same storm, and this is a true story, crushed one of my best friend's houses about 8 miles away while he was in it with his family. He put his family in you know who I'm talking about, right? I'll tell you the story and you remember. He put his family in the bathtub and then hovered over them, and his house was destroyed around him. The roof came down and crushed him. It hurt his back. He had to go to physical therapy, and it can be a pretty catastrophic event, even for those who are prepared. So there is a good amount of luck that goes into this as well, these scenarios. But luck favors the prepared, and our goal here is to help prepare you and to help prepare ourselves by using these experiences and telling these stories in a formula that allows us to hopefully make it entertaining and make it something memorable. So let's do a quick review of what we covered today. We had the very basic needs of survival, short-term survival. Mm-hmm. What were those?
Our air, our food, our water, our health.
Sustenance and health.
Our shelter.
And maintaining body temperature through shelter, fire, equipment, etc. are 3 for a short term. However, in order to maintain long-term survival, what is it important to foster?
It is extremely important to foster community for your longer-term survival.
Absolutely. And when you're dealing with maintaining stores and equipment, make sure you're maintaining them, that you're using them, that you know how to use the equipment that you have, and that you know how to use the food that you have as well. And always keep on hand the big 5: fresh, clean water, food with the ability to cook it, lanterns and candles, an ability to charge your electronics, and lots of extra blankets. So I hope you had as much fun as we did making this. If you want to see more content like this, hit the like button so that we know you enjoyed it. If we get enough attention on this thing, we're going to start doing more of these podcasts. Our next Fireside Chat is going to be a deep dive into hypothermia, which I find extremely fascinating, especially when you start getting into severe hypothermic responses and paradoxical undressing, which is a real thing, and I can tell you all about it. Until then, eat food, drink water, stay safe, and maintain body temperature.